Hello, my friends. Welcome back to BarryTsGarage. I am back with Steve Coppock. Come on along. I appreciate you coming with us. Hey there, Steve.
Hey, Barry. It's good to see you. Welcome back.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back, and I'm so excited about getting some explanations from you on modifying flatheads.
Yeah, Barry. That's I like the history, of course, but what I find is some people want to see what's available out there to modify flatheads, and I have brought some stuff out that we can talk about today, so that those that want to maybe improve the performance of their flathead, maybe they're rebuilding it anyway and just want to see what's available. We'll talk about some of that. Some people I find just like the motors to look better.
Sure.
You know, that they run fine in some people's opinion, that they just like dress them up a little bit. So today I brought some stuff out, and we'll kind of go, maybe start at the oil pan and go up, and or start with cylinder heads. I don't know. We'll figure it out and walk through it.
Can you just explain the purpose for that build right behind you here, and what's up with that?
Oh, well, I would love to do that. So one of the things I do is make supercharger kits for flatheads. There's a few people around the world that do it. I use a design that Joe Abbin created about 30 years ago, and Joe's got to the point where he doesn't want to pack boxes, as he says.
Yeah.
So I licensed his drawings, and so I make, with the help of some good machine shops and polishing folks around town, this supercharger kit. So this is my display engine.
Okay.
It's actually not a real running engine, but it looks like it could run. But yeah, this is, I think, one of the best. I often say, if you see a better looking engine somewhere, let me know.
Yeah.
Because from a flathead standpoint, they clean up really nice. Polished cylinder heads. This one has a supercharger, polished pulleys and things like that. And I think it looks phenomenal. Even if it didn't run very good,
it really
does. It looks good.
It looks fantastic. So, what? Just point. Why don't you just go from top to bottom? Just point out what these different items are.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a modern carburetor. This is a Holley carburetor, 4-barrel. Some people prefer the old Stromberg 97 look, and on my little white race car it has similar supercharger, but has Stromberg carburetors on it, so we could look at that if you want. But it's a modern carburetor. You can buy it pretty much anywhere. This is a Weiand 174. That's the size, the displacement of the supercharger on top.
Okay.
The way it's set up here on a flathead, with the pulley ratio, upper and lower pulleys, makes about 5 to 7 pounds of boost, which is not a lot by today's standards, meaning modern car standards, but it's about what a flathead likes. You're still limited by how much air you can get in and out of the motor, and that they don't breathe all that well.
Yeah.
But 5 to 7 pounds wakes them right up.
Okay.
This is a distributor that's an electronic distributor. Made by Stromberg in England, so it has an electronic module in it, so it is reliable and is probably as good as any distributor out there. This one has a belt tensioning system. It uses a serpentine belt, and some people like the look of the V-belt setups on old motors. I do too. But the modern serpentine belts, this is a 6-rib design, they really work well. They grip really good. And a supercharger, even a small one like this on a flathead, takes 40 to 50 horsepower to turn, and it's really difficult to get the V-belts to have enough friction to actually turn them at higher RPMs. So there's slippage.
Yeah.
In the old days, some people, and you may remember, but some people watching will remember, you used to be able to buy matched sets of V-belts that are the same length. You can't do that anymore. So you go to the parts store, I don't care which store you go to, you get 2 identical V-belts. They will not be the same length. And it takes more than 1 V-belt to run a supercharger. So you might have 2 or 3 belts on a supercharger, but you're really going to drive it with 1, and that's just not going to work. So this works out good. It has a modern spring-loaded tensioner on it. And so this tensioner actually has off of a 6-cylinder Jeep engine. So it's something you can buy anywhere, and the bracket is something unique to this design.
Yeah, you've got the setup where the a compact alternator fits right in with the supercharger, obviously.
Yeah, I think they look better if the case is not vented like these are.
Mm-hmm.
And I have some that are physically a little bit larger that I think look a little better on the Flathead. They are a little bit harder to fit.
Mm-hmm.
But I think these work great. They put out about 90 amps and they work just fine.
Yeah.
And very reliable.
Excellent.
These are Ford water pumps. They're just, they're reproduction, of course, but there's nothing unique about the water pump themselves. But the pulley is different. This circle right where my finger is a steel hub that's pressed onto the shaft of the water pump. So you have to press the old, typically cast iron pulley off and press on that hub, and then the aluminum pulley just bolts to it.
Okay.
Same with the crank, that there's a steel hub that fits on the crankshaft and then some bolts that hold that pulley on.
Okay. Right. And then you've also got, it looks like some headers attached.
Yeah, these are really just for display. They're stainless steel headers,
Okay.
but would work really well. They have nice thick flanges, so they bolt up, and stainless steel, they probably last, literally forever.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So now we know what the ultimate maybe might be. Why don't we now back off to talk about kind of some basic things, or maybe kind of go from the bottom up, like we said. Is there, when we say the bottom, we think oil pan? Is there something you can do with oil pans?
Yeah, I would like to talk about the oil pans, if you will let me, though.
Yeah.
I'm getting ready, not this engine, but one very similar to it. It's painted black, but otherwise it's very similar. I'm getting ready to test it on an engine dynamometer here in town in Phoenix, probably later this week. So I'm anxious to see how it does. My prediction is 280 or so horsepower, maybe as much as 300. And you think as you're watching, we're thinking stock. I think the most they ever made was a Mercury, in the 52, 53 standpoint, 125 horsepower. So to go from that to close to 300 is quite a change.
That's a big jump.
So we'll talk today. Not everybody's going to want or need a 275 horse flathead.
Yeah.
But if you do, there's parts we'll talk about today that would get you there or somewhere in between.
Well, I really look forward to seeing that dynamometer test.
Yeah.
That's good, because now someone's really putting it out there instead of just making up stories. We're going to see some data.
Well, I think what some people might be surprised, right? Even hearing that kind of number is possible. And of course, the supercharger is a big part of that. Anytime you can force more air and fuel into an engine, typically you can make more power. But to take something, and I know we talked a few weeks ago, when you start at 65 horsepower in 1932 and think about the same basic design, being able to get close to 300 horsepower on pump gasoline,
right,
is quite an achievement. So we'll walk through the various elements of that and learn along the way, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay, Steve, as we want to get into some performance mods, how do we measure performance, or how do we get performance?
It's not hard to explain how to measure it, but it is a little bit tricky on how to actually change the performance and make it better. It's kind of an art. Think of all the people that have developed race car parts over the years, right? And there's expertise in all different areas. But some people might be surprised to know that you can't measure horsepower. We always talk about how much horsepower an engine makes. It's, bench racing, how much horsepower, when a new car comes out, well, how many horsepower does it have? It's not a factor that you can directly measure. You can measure torque, which is the units on that are foot-pounds or pound-feet, depending on where you were raised.
Right.
For me, it was foot-pounds, but I know on the West Coast, most people call it pound-feet, and it's okay. I get it either way.
Right.
But you can measure that. That's something. If you strap something down, put a scale on it, start the engine like this dynamometer we're talking about, you can measure the force that the motor exerts on your scale directly. You can also measure the revolutions per minute, or the RPMs of the engine. And it's those two things, how much force and how fast you're applying the force, goes into an equation that that will determine the horsepower.
So horsepower is kind of calculated, not measured?
That's right. Horsepower is a calculated number, an important one. Torque can be directly measured. So an engine dynamometer is measuring torque and revolutions per minute, and then a calculation that's a standard in the world to calculate the resulting horsepower.
Okay.
So when we talk about modifications, and this is important, we're really mostly about increasing the torque available on an engine and determining where that maximum torque is going to be in the RPM range. If you have a truck or a piece of agricultural equipment, you're not going to spin the motor very fast. You want all of that torque to be available pretty low down in the RPM range. On the other hand, if you're trying to build a race car, you want as much torque as high in the RPM range as you can so that you have more horsepower. Something I heard years ago is torque will determine if you can get up the hill, horsepower to determine how fast you can get up the hill.
Uh-huh.
So I kind of think of it like that. If the absolute speed is not important, then diesel trucks, they're relatively low RPM, but very high torque and very capable of pulling heavy loads.
Yeah.
So with all that said, just keep it in the back of your mind. What we're trying to do is increase the torque or the force that the engine puts out.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're looking for high performance, we're going to be trying to do that relatively high in the RPM range.
Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
All right.
Yes. Okay, we're on board.
So the first thing, since we said we were going to start down low, on a flathead, there's differences in the oil pan. And we don't think about this very much, but the amount of the crankshaft, when you're idling around town or you're driving down the freeway, maybe it's 1,500, 2,000 RPM, not very high. But when the crankshaft's spinning around like that, it's a big heavy thing. There's oil in there, and the crankshaft it comes in contact with the oil, and there are some power losses. They call windage losses. So it's the wind that the crankshaft makes as it's spinning inside the engine, and the oil that's in there, and that having to spin the crank through a shower of oil results in some power loss, especially at higher RPMs. Because what happens at the higher RPMs is that windage, that crank whipping around, it'll actually pick oil up off the bottom of the oil pan. That wind will mix and aerate, so mix with air. So now you don't just have oil, you got a mixture of oil and air. And that doesn't make a very good lubricant either.
Mm-hmm.
So the best, if you can keep the oil separate from the wind, that's a good thing.
Yep.
And so some people, this is an example of a generation 1 or 2 or series 1 and 2 oil pan. So this would be 48 and back.
Yep.
And since it has this little crankcase vent hole here, we know it's 1935 and up. But other than that, I probably can't pinpoint it for you.
Okay.
Actually, there is something else I could use to identify it. But you can see the oil just sits in the bottom of this pan.
Mm-hmm.
This is where the dipstick would go, right through here. This one happens to be broken off, but it goes right through there. But really, there's nothing in here with this crank spinning that results in, it would result in a lot of windage loss if you were spinning it at high RPM.
Yep.
This is an interesting oil pan, I think. Was on 1949, 50, and 51 Mercuries.
Okay.
From the factory. This pan has not been modified in any way. It's interesting to me that it came from Ford with this tray in here, and a lot of people will recognize this as a windage tray.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there so that oil can still drain down around the corners and get in the bottom of the pan, but is somewhat isolated from that wind that the crank is making as it's spinning.
Okay.
Even the oil pickup, which bolts to the oil pump, has a cover on top so that when it's in place, it almost completely isolates the bottom of the oil pan from the top of the oil pan. So this is like a favorite flathead oil pan. It doesn't really work on earlier engines, but certainly if you're building an 8BA or a Mercury version of the 8BA, this is sort of the pan to get if you want to try to reduce windage losses in your motor. I think the next logical thing to talk about is the crankshafts. One of the ways to there's really just a handful of ways to actually increase the torque. you can increase the size of the engine, the displacement. So we're talking both the bore and the stroke. More bore gives you a more surface area for the combustion process to act upon. So if you think of the combustion in resulting in pounds per square inch of gas, or the combustion process produces a high temperature gas that's pushing down. The more surface area you have, the more force you'll end up with. The pounds per square inch will be the same, but you'll have more square inches, so you end up with a higher force. And force directly translates into torque. The other way is to increase the stroke of the crankshaft. So more leverage, if you will, right? So like putting a cheater on a breaker bar or something, right? You got longer leverage arm. Same force results in more torque at the point that you're trying to move. So same with a crankshaft. The longer the stroke, in general, will result in the same force. You'll have more torque applied to the crankshaft. The stock Ford crank, and this is a 3 3/4 inch stroke, and all the Ford cranks from 1932 to 1953, Ford cranks were all 3 3/4 inch stroke. The Mercury cranks from 49 to 53 were 4-inch stroke, so a 1/4 inch longer stroke, and that results in more torque. That's an example. 3 3/4. The Mercury would be a 4-inch. This is 4 1/8. But you can buy 4 1/4 inch stroke, and I think even beyond that in the aftermarket. And in the early days, they used to weld cranks and grind them, and the 4 1/4 was about the max on a stock casting. But so again, increasing the stroke will increase the torque, and then depending on how fast we can spin it, that'll increase the horsepower. So that's the sort of the crankshaft thing. A lot of people, if they have a regular old Ford with a 3 3/4 inch stroke, they're probably going to turn the crank anyway. So it's a good time to look for a Mercury crank and go ahead and make that 4-inch stroke jump, because they're probably buying new pistons anyway, because it probably needs to be bored. So it's a relatively easy thing to do if you're in the middle of a rebuild, to find a Mercury crank, and when you're buying pistons, just get the right piston for that stroke. And you'll go for 239 or so to 255 cubic inches just in the process of the rebuild. That's money well spent right there.
Excellent.
On to the other way to increase displacement is to increase the bore, the bore of the cylinders. The early motors we talked about, 3 1/16 is a standard bore. The later motors, the 239 cubic inch motors and the 255 inch Mercuries, were all 3 3/16 bore from the factory. It's hard to find an engine that's this old that hasn't been bored 2, 3, 4, 5 times maybe. So it's really difficult to find a block that has a stock or near stock bore. It's also very hard these days to find pistons, because there's just not a demand for them, because they've already been bored that maybe 50 years ago. So, but I'm of the belief that keep the bore to the minimum. Boring them 1/8 to 3 5/16 is a pretty common thing these days. In fact, on my way over here this morning, a guy called and he had this very question. He was at 90 over and he couldn't find 100 over pistons, and can I go to 3 5/16? And my answer is, if it was me, I would find or have made the 100 over pistons, because I just hate to bore them beyond. But the truth is, 3 5/16 is a pretty typical size for a piston these days. What's interesting is this one, because it's on here, made by Ross, but there's plenty of other great piston companies. Pistons made by Molly, Ross, Carrillo has the old Arias pistons, and they're all good, really good. This is a forged piston, not necessary really for a standard rebuild. Cast pistons are out there. Speedway carries them. Eggy makes them or carries them. In a supercharged motor, I like to run the forged pistons, although at relatively low boost, not necessarily required. This is not an original piston, but you can kind of look, at how there's grooves cut in the side of it and 2 oil control rings, relatively wide rings, and there's a lot of friction when you have four rings and they're relatively wide. The newer pistons you can get, such as this one, have what's called a metric ring pack, which there's only 3, but you can see how much thinner even the top compression rings are.
Yeah, those ring lands are noticeably smaller.
Yeah, and what we're talking about with this is less friction. One of the reasons they were built the way they were is, really the ring technology back in the day. Now we have much better technology, how to finish the bore of the cylinder, a lot of experience, and the piston design and the alloys that they use for pistons, much better. So this is possible now to run a modern piston in an old, 70, 80, 90-year-old engine. And it's a great way to reduce friction. New cars have these small, they call them metric rings. And I don't know about you, but if you've driven a new car lately, they don't burn oil.
Right.
And they make great power.
Yeah.
And they do it with design very similar to this right here.
Is there anything you do different to prep the block for these different rings?
Well, I'm not really a great machinist, but the machinists do know how to prep and bore and hone the blocks to get the finish that's needed so that these new ring packages work well. So they are different, but probably not the guy to explain the differences.
Yeah, that's cool.
I wanted to show the connecting rods, and this is if you remember with these little cutouts in here, this would be for 49 to 53 with the insert style rod bearings. And these are great rods. Henry Ford and his team of engineers back in the day, they were great metallurgists. They came out with some crazy good forgings. And these rods, even though they look relatively small by today's standards, they are super strong. And I personally would use them in just about anything.
No kidding.
Including a supercharged engine with 5 to 7 pounds boost like these make. Maybe just polish the beams a little bit and use them. But there are also aftermarket versions of Ford connecting rods, still for the insert style bearings. They're different than the Ford bearings.
Good.
But with a very robust design, and these are available. SCAT makes them, SCAT, and Eagle makes a very similar rod. Both very good rods, and I would say bulletproof. If you're going to, it costs a bit to have these refurbished. They have a bronze bushing in the end, so you have to install a new one of those and have it honed and refinish the big end. So you have some money invested in reconditioning these rods, and sometimes these just make sense to go buy a brand new rod that you can use out of the box.
Sure. Yeah.
So this doesn't really improve horsepower or torque and resulting horsepower, but if you're in the middle of building your motor, that's something to consider.
Tell me about how camshafts interact with performance flatheads.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. It's a critical piece, and I think we talked about, when we were talking about cylinder head volumes and compression ratios and all, that you sort of have to match everything together. The cylinder head, the cam, valve size, the intended use of the engine, meaning where do you want that torque peak to occur? Is it something that's going to be pulling a load? Is it a heavy vehicle? Is it something you're just going to take to the track and race? And that helps you pick all these various components, how much porting and relieving you might be doing. But it all has to be considered together. And the real piece, in my mind, that makes it all work, maybe as you intend or as you designed it or thought of it in your mind, is the camshaft. This is what controls when the valves open, how long they stay open, when they close. There's a term called overlap. So, how long is the intake and the exhaust valve open at the same time? All of that is controlled by the camshaft. And interestingly, they don't cost much different regardless of how you want it to work, but you have to think about those specifications as you're picking your cylinder heads, valves, compression ratio, bore and stroke, all of that, to get the cam that you need to make it all work together. Because if you pick the wrong cam, you'll be disappointed. People generally, and I'm one of them, people generally want a car that sounds real rowdy at an idle, high performance guys.
Yeah.
And I put myself in that category. And the reason it sounded like that is because it's not running really very well.
Right.
Because it's not really made to make power at idle. It's made to make power in the upper RPM range. And when you get that motor up in the RPM range, it'll smooth out and make great power. But if you want that power down at the low end, it's going to have a smooth idle, and it's going to have great torque and pulling power, easy to drive around town on the highway, with the torque peak being lower in the RPM range rather than maybe higher in the RPM range. So you can certainly pick the wrong cam and get one that's too big because you like the sound at idle, and maybe that's okay. But if you don't think about it ahead of time, you can get your engine together and be really disappointed by the cam that you pick. This is a key component. It's got to be thought through really well. The cam companies have great resources. They have far more experience than any of us do with, picking the right cam for your application. So my advice, pick the phone up, call your cam manufacturer of choice, tell them what you're trying to do, and they will help you dial in and pick the right camshaft.
Steve, you've got a nice block here on display.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. This one's just about ready to go back together. The boring has already been done. There's been some valve relief work done. The seats have been ground for valves. What's not been done yet is the actual porting to make the ports where they flow better and maybe slightly enlarge them. So other than that, this block's ready to go. Getting air in and out are important to making more power. The blocks are castings, and they're relatively robust castings, but they're production. They're making hundreds of thousands of these a year and just cranking them out every day. So the ports are relatively good, but there's improvement to be had in the ports. So on a flathead Ford, the intake ports are up here. So it's an 8-cylinder, so there's 8 intake ports up on top. And the exhaust we talked about are actually inside the block. So this is an exhaust port, goes around and comes out right here.
Yeah, okay.
So if you were to measure, how many inches of exhaust port that's in a flathead block, it's up pretty close to 30. And that's one of the reasons they run warm. Some people, call them hot water heaters. Well, in a way, they are.
Or what did Joe call it? Liquid-cooled exhaust?
Something like that. But so some mild porting will clean up these blocks pretty easily.
Can you explain what the word porting means?
That's great. Yeah, but when I say porting, what I'm talking about is slightly enlarging the size of the ports, cleaning up what's called the bowl area, which is right down in here, both on the intake and exhaust.
And this is really smoothing the casting.
Smoothing. So we're trying to get air in, and the more or the less sharp turns that have to be made, the less obstacles that the air has to run into, and the fuel in this case, the more will flow in. The easier the path, the better chance it has of filling up the cylinder with air and fuel like you want.
Excellent.
So you're really, again, trying to pack more air and more fuel into the cylinder so that when the combustion process does occur, you get a bigger explosion, a bigger combustion process, and higher force. This area between the valves and the cylinder is an important area to focus on. There's about a 15% flow increase that's possible by the way the block is what's called relieved between the valves and the cylinder.
Okay.
This is not a factory relief. This is a relief that blends the intake and exhaust valves into the cylinder area, and does result in an improved flow. I would recommend, somebody's, again, if you've got your engine apart and you're just wanting to improve it a little bit, even if you don't change the cam or even not messing with this displacement, cleaning up these ports a little bit through porting and adding a valve relief is something relatively easy to do, and does result in a pretty good, noticeable seat of the pants feel to the motor when it's back together. The other thing, while we're here talking about it, Barry, is the size of the intake valves, or the valves themselves.
Okay.
In stock form, Ford used 1.5-inch diameter intake and exhaust valves.
Okay.
there's performance to be gained in the valve train area. Most of the time, the valves get replaced or at least ground. The faces refinished as part of a rebuild process. And there are some very good aftermarket valves out there that do improve flow. We'll talk maybe just a little bit more in a minute. But one of the modifications that's been made to this block is the exhaust valves are still 1.5 inch diameter, but the intakes are 1.6 inch diameter.
Oh, okay.
So you have to open up the throat area of that valve a little bit, and it hasn't been done yet to this. When I said it needed to be ported earlier, that's one of the things that needs to be addressed. But a bigger valves can help improve flow. On a stock rebuild, the 1.5 inch valves are, I think, just fine, intake and exhaust. The next step up sort of on the performance ladder is probably 1.6 intakes, and the next step might be 1.6 exhaust. But there's diminishing returns at some point. It's not the valve size that's the limitation.
Yeah.
It's the physical port size.
Right.
But anyway, all of those are intended to help get more air and more fuel into the cylinder to generate a higher force on the top of the piston and through the crankshaft and increase the torque of the motor. This is the most economical modification that we've talked about so far.
Okay.
And again, we're looking at things that can be done to increase the power, not necessarily increase the drivability, but are things that to think about as you're putting your design for your motor together. Okay. One thing that's super easy to do is if you could come over, Barry, as we mentioned, the exhaust in the center these two center cylinders flow through the same passage out of the block right down through here.
Yep.
They also can come up through this port here that's blocked and through the intake manifold. Not into where the air and fuel is, but underneath of the passages for air and fuel, there's an exhaust passage that runs from one side of the engine to the other. And that's to heat the intake manifold. And there's an advantage for that. Certainly when it's cold outside, some heat in the intake manifold helps the engine run better in cold weather, especially initial starting and driving. So it's desired to have that passage for, I'd say, the average car. Almost every car, even today, has some way to preheat the intake system. Sometimes it's just an electric heater. But for performance applications, you want the air and fuel to be as cool as you can get it, because cool means dense. So more air, more fuel for the temperature outside. And when you heat it, air expands, fuel expands, and you get less air and fuel in the engine, which means less power potential. So an easy thing to do is just to plug these top ports right here. And we saw, well, you may have seen engines that use a penny, a Lincoln penny.
Yeah. And
that does work. They're copper pennies. I prefer these little plugs, whether they're called freeze plugs or core plugs, but you can buy them at any parts store and drive these in and they stay put. But that blocks off those passages up into the intake manifold, and that's a cheap and easy performance modification for a flathead.
Awesome. We'll put that on the list for sure. Anybody that wants to keep them in there because they want the drivability when it's cold, it's like, well, why are you driving your hot rod in the winter?
Well, my thought is they warm up pretty quick anyway, so I don't worry too much about it.
Not too worried.
I've never been disappointed by plugging these up. But having a hot intake manifold, especially the same temperatures at your exhaust, which under power is about over 1,000 degrees. So
that's a lot of heat.
I just don't need that heat in the top of the motor.
Right.
And so I think, and these plugs are about 50 cents a piece, and they just drive in with a hammer and you're done.
Yeah, very good.
As we talked about a minute ago, the stock valves in a flathead are all 1.5 inches, both intake and exhaust. What I wanted to show here was sort of how valves have progressed. This valve here is a new replacement flathead valve.
Okay.
This one happens to be, since it doesn't have the mushroom on the top, this happens to be 49 to 53, or the third generation, the third series valve. But sort of right away, if you're thinking of flow, you can see how that little ridge right there would not be beneficial for improving flow.
It's not smooth.
It's not. So again, back to someone maybe rebuilding their flathead engine, there are better valves, well, better from a flow standpoint. These are just fine from a reliability standpoint. And an example here is right next to it. This is a modern, this happens to be a small block Chevy exhaust valve. 1.5 inch is a typical stock size small block Chevy exhaust valve. It has a 45 degree angle, which is the same as the flathead.
Okay.
It also, we can see just by looking, the stem is much smaller, narrower. So, and it's undercut, they call it right here. So the stem is even reduced in size. It's what's called a swirl polish on it. And all of that's intended to improve flow into the cylinder.
Interesting.
And you can see a pretty big difference in those two side by side.
Sure can.
If you're, even if you're really not a flow expert, if you will, I think you can see that this valve will flow better than this valve.
100%.
And small block Chevy exhaust valves are pretty cheap. You know, they're probably cheaper than a stock replacement valve. So a lot of people put the small block Chevy exhaust valves both in the intake and exhaust when they're rebuilding their flathead. And I think that's a good improvement. It really doesn't cost much, if anything, more to do, and it certainly improves the flow.
Yeah.
So even if you don't do a bunch of porting or polishing, that's an easy way, I think, and a relatively cheap way to improve the flow in a flathead motor. I think the next logical step is to talk about cylinder heads. The flathead cylinder heads are actually very robust. Lot of research went into those heads by Henry Ford and his team at the time. The chamber shape changed over the years, and I think in our earlier videos we looked at a 1932 that had a heart-shaped chamber. It evolved to a chamber that looks like these here in the later years. And the spark plug placement is particularly important. The exhaust valves, these spark plug holes are very close to the exhaust valves. They're offset to the exhaust side. And in the words of a good friend of mine, Ford knew that they were going to ignite somewhere, and they knew the exhaust was probably the hottest area. And so having the spark plug there helped them have one combustion and not two.
Interesting.
And so, you know, spark plug location, I think you'll find, and no matter who makes the cylinder heads, is going to be offset to the side of the exhaust valve. And if you think about improving torque and getting the most air and fuel in, and then compressing it as high as you reasonably can without it self-igniting or detonating, you want to increase the compression ratio. And the compression ratio is really just the volume of the cylinder with the piston at the very bottom of the bore compared to the volume of the cylinder and the combustion chamber with the piston at the top of the bore. That's the compression ratio. So a flathead, you're kind of fighting a couple of competing battles. This area, including the area over the piston, but this area here over the valves, is considered the combustion chamber. So if we make this smaller, we will increase the compression ratio. But there's a couple of competing factors. One is you still have to be able to get the valves open, because the valves open into this area. So you're limited by how far open you want to get the valves. And the smaller this gets, generally speaking, the flow out of the valves into the combustion chamber is more restrictive. It's a smaller area for the exhaust and the intake to get in. So you're kind of competing. You'd like the compression ratio to be high, but on the other hand, you don't want to get it so high that you have pre-ignition or you can't get the valves open or the valves hit the head. So you're fighting sort of a battle there. But one thing I would give anybody advice on, if you're going to go to a set of aftermarket aluminum heads, you got to make sure that you pick a head and a cam at the same time. Because the lift on the cam, if you have a chamber that's only, I'm making a number up here, but 3/10 of an inch deep, and you have a cam that has a valve lift 4/10 of an inch, then it's just not going to work. Right. You can't even bolt the heads on. When you order them, you can see what lift cam they will accommodate. This happens to be an Offenhauser head here, and on the end of it, it's stamped 425. And so this head will accommodate a lift of just over 4/10 of an inch, which is about as big as anybody on a street flathead would ever need.
Okay.
It also has a bigger chamber to accommodate that higher lift than some Offenhauser heads.
Right.
So
yeah, you can definitely see the difference in that amount of space there compared to here.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So one of the ways that a chamber, you can compare chambers other than the depth is the volume of the chamber. And the head manufacturers do publish that information. You can see it in the description of the cylinder head. And what that means is if you were to fill up this combustion chamber, all of it, including the area above the piston and this, with most of the time a fluid is used, it would be how many cubic centimeters of fluid it would take to fill that chamber up.
Okay.
These two heads here, that has been done to. This one it hasn't. But the results are written down here at the bottom. So 69, 69, 66, and 67 is the volume of this chamber. So you can use what
are the units of measurement?
It's cc's, a metric cc's. So this has a slightly bigger chamber than this one.
Okay.
So it's both deeper,
yeah,
and physically larger. In the supercharging world, somewhere around an 8-to-1 compression ratio is what you're shooting for, and what that results in is typically somewhere 75, 77, 80 cc's, depending on the displacement of the crank and the pistons. So, and the supercharging, you know, this head here with around 73 would be a better choice than this one for most supercharging.
Okay, we've moved on up to the intakes, it looks like.
Yeah, we're getting pretty close to the top. Back again to how much air and fuel we can get into the motor, the better. We talked about the really early 32, 33 motors having a 1-barrel carburetor, 34 going to a 2-barrel carburetor, and it really, that's pretty much what they had all the way through 1953. Of course, you can improve performance, not just solely with these other things we've talked about, but you have to have the capability to get more fuel into the motor. And generally that means a bigger carburetor or multiple carburetors. I've got a couple examples here, and there are literally hundreds of different designs for flathead manifolds. The Museum of Speed in Lincoln, Nebraska, if anybody's ever through there, they need to stop and take a look, not just at the flathead stuff, but that's probably the best collection of flathead speed equipment in the world.
Really? And that's in Lincoln, Nebraska?
Lincoln, Nebraska.
Okay.
This is an example of a 3 2-barrel intake for the Series 1 and 2 engines. There's actually a 4 2-barrel version of these manifolds. Edelbrock made it, I think several others did too, but you could get up to 4 2-barrel intake manifold for a flathead.
No kidding.
This 2 2-barrel, not necessarily this particular one, but a 2 2-barrel intake, probably the most popular. You certainly see more of the 2 2-barrels out there than the 3 2-barrels or the 4 2-barrels. It makes a nice intake for the flathead. It's got twice the flow capacity, so it's it accommodates a little bit of an improved cam, a little bit bigger motor, and works just fine. This one is an Offenhauser, but Edelbrock and others Navarro make intakes like similar to this for the flatheads, and they sure look good.
They look great,
right? That's we didn't really talk about it, but sometimes it's more about how it looks than how much power it makes, and so flatheads really clean up good, and I think these just make them a lot more fun to look at, and that they have the capability to make them have more torque and more horsepower, but the look is a part of it too.
I'm going to make you tell us about one more option.
Oh, well, I certainly will. And so I'm just going to set this over to the side. And what we're going to talk about, I think, is, the supercharger route. And, if you're trying to get, and whether it's a flathead or really any internal combustion engine, a diesel, if you can help the air and fuel get into the motor, you can make more force inside the cylinder, more torque, and depending on where that is applied, you make more horsepower. And many times it's a very impressive amount of increase. So on a flathead, we're limited a little bit by the fact that they only have 3 main bearings in the bottom of the motor. We're also limited by how much the ports being in the block, the exhaust, the intake. So there are some physical limitations on how much power we should try to get out of a flathead.
Mm-hmm.
So the supercharger, whether it's the one that I provide or others, we're really just trying to get more air and fuel into the chamber, into the gullers, so we can make more force, more torque, and ultimately more horsepower.
Yeah.
So I mentioned it, I think, at the start of this video about this particular package that we have here. But this is the intake manifold, and we just happen to have the other ones we just looked at right next to us.
Yeah.
This is machined out of one piece of aluminum. So we can get creative with the port design. We can optimize it for flow, the size, and of course, when you make something on a CNC, computer numerical controlled machine, they're going to be the same every single time. So they fit well, they look well, and they perform well because of the design and the ability to make them. So this is what this intake manifold looks like. It's a beautiful piece in my personal opinion.
Sure it is.
It's made right here in Phoenix, Arizona. But again, Joe Abbin's design from about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Still very relevant in the flathead performance world. This intake, pretty universal. It'll take a couple of different size superchargers. It'll work on the series, I would say series 1 and 2, but I really mean, I think it'll physically bolt on any flathead.
Okay.
But we talked about the earlier engines having a short crankshaft and water pumps on the heads and things like that. That probably not the best fit for this, but certainly the 59 series and the 8BAs, this is a direct bolt-on. It'll take a couple of different superchargers. The way they're set up, whether it's this one or someone else's, 5 to 7 pounds of boost on the street with pump gas is about what you're looking for. And that's with some good porting work, relieving a little bit of displacement increase in the right cam. 250 to 300 horsepower is where you're going to end up. Supercharger, this one will typically add about 50% more power than whatever you started with. So if you have a pretty souped up flathead, I'm making this up, but 150 horsepower, you can expect about another 75 or so. If you have one that's more like 180 horsepower, you're up closer to the 300. I just wanted to show a couple of examples. Of course, you can adapt really any supercharger to the flathead within reason. It has to be relatively small because there's a relatively small footprint on top of the flathead. So I just have 2 examples here. This one is a Weiand 142 blower, and this is a really cool reproduction SCOT blower. SCOT is superchargers of Torin, I think is the original name. They go back into the 30s and 40s, and it's reproduced over in California by the Herman family over there, and they do a great job with this. Very authentic looking and performs really well. The Weiand one, kind of an interesting story there. I won't tell the whole story, but Holley owns Weiand, but they decided to quit making their supercharger line a couple of years ago. So I was fortunate enough to be able to buy the excess inventory from Holley, and I can't really say it's a Weiand supercharger anymore. It's really mine, but it'll still have the Weiand name on it. But I do provide these for people that need them, whether it's for a flathead or for a small block Chevy or whatever they happen to have.
Right on.
But both of them are a good size for the flathead, about the same internal size. So if you spin them the same, they produce about the same output.
The one on the left is physically bigger, but you're saying the airflow is about the same.
Yes, it's certainly bigger on the outside, but on the inside it's very similar to the Weiand 142. Both really good superchargers. The reason I think I have what I have is I want to learn, right? I want to see what the differences are. I want to, see what one manufacturer's heads look like and how they measure out the different, valves, pistons, rods, cranks. I just want to see, and then I can learn from that, and then carry that forward for advice to folks that are trying to do the same thing I'm doing, build flatheads, and carry that tradition on into the future.
That's excellent. Okay, thanks again, Steve.
You're welcome. See ya.
Thank you for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.